Hello, and thank you for joining me for another Grievers Empowerment Moment. In this episode, we'll discuss grief and change. I want to start with the definition of grief. And I know we've talked about this and we reviewed this definition many times, but it is important that we revisit the definition of grief so that we are keenly aware that grief is not solely about death. So, the definition of grief, one of which that I really love, says grief is the normal and natural emotional response to a loss or change of any kind. I'll say it again. Grief is the normal and natural emotional response to a loss or change of any kind. And what I want to focus on tonight is one word in this definition that is really powerful as it relates to grief. And that word is change. Historically, we have thought of grief being related to loss or grief being solely related to death. But this definition of grief helps us to understand that grief is also about change. And this is the definition that is often overlooked, and it's misclassified as everything except grief. So, we want to talk about that. So, historically, grief has been associated with death only, but death is not solely the main identifier for grief. As we discussed and will continue to discuss, that grief is about change. And as we revisit this and as we talk about grief being about change, it will help us to increase our awareness to the grievers that are around us, or the fact that we may be experiencing an episode or an experience in our life that is actually grief that we have misidentified. I've often heard people say, I don't know why I'm feeling this way. I don't understand what's going on with me. And sometimes we have to stop and ask ourselves the question, what has changed? And if we can identify what has changed and what emotional response it has brought to us, we could likely direct our emotions to being equated with grief. It's different. But if we place, all of the pieces together, we may see that grief is more present in our lives than we actually realize. And as we really identify what grief is, not only does it increase our awareness, it will also increase our sensitivity to the people that are around us. And it will give us a better opportunity to give and or receive support as we are grieving or as people around us are grieving. So let's think about changes that may be associated with grief. Let's start with relationships. This is huge because there are so many different relationships. There are work relationships, there are social relationships, there are marital relationships, and all of these relationships experience change. And I must say that all of the changes that relationships go through are not bad. Relationships go through stages. The marriage relationship goes through stating of friendship and courtship, engagement and marriage. All of those things are happy, good times, but changes can occur in those stages of relationship. And just because things change, it doesn't mean that it's bad. Grief can happen and it be something good. Let's think about the mother-child relationship. As a mother carries a baby for 9 months, there's a relationship that is built. There's a relationship that is formed and nurtured, and there's a familiar pattern of behavior that is established. Once that baby is born, the relationship between the mother and the child changes. Whereas the mother had been the sole provider, the sole nurturer for that child, the mother now has a community. to help her support and care for that child. Whereas the mother was responsible for every bit of nutrients that the baby received, now that has changed. There is a change in the pattern of behavior between that mother and child. And now there are other people involved in this child's life. Is that a bad thing? Absolutely not. But it is a change that can occur. And many mothers experience what has been historically called postpartum depression. What I really believe that is a change. There's a change in a familiar pattern of behavior. So change can happen when change happens, grief can occur. And it doesn't have to be a bad thing. Let me show you another example. Change can occur in work relationships. Think about a person that's been on a job for 30 years and they are accustomed to a familiar pattern of behavior. Not just a pattern of behavior, they are keenly aware of familiar people and familiar routines. And when this exciting time in their life of retirement happens, there are major changes. There are changes in their daily activities and their responsibilities and their level of communication. Nothing bad has happened. It's been a great experience, but change has occurred. And this may prompt an emotional response. This is grief. It's normal and it's natural to have an emotional response, good or bad, to a loss or a change of any kind. Let's think about something else that can change. Behaviors. A change in behavior can cause grief. So, what change in behavior am I talking about? One that is very relevant in our society right now, as we see parents or family members aging, we see memory changes, early onset of dementia. And we see these subtle changes and we're like, wow, I never thought that I would see, me having to remind someone to take their medication or have to remind someone of what our phone number is, the things that they've always done that seem so familiar that we have to remind people of. That's a change in mental status, mental awareness can cause grief for the person and the family that's supporting that person. Think about it. And then there can also be changes in roles. This is often seen in parent-child relationships. In the parent-child relationship, the parent is the caregiver caring for the child. But as parents begin to age, there may be sickness that occurs or long-term illness where the children or the child must take care of the parents. That is different. It's different for the parent to be the one in need of caregiving and support. And it's different for the child to be the one caring for their parent. Although these things happen and it's totally normal, it is a change in what has been familiar for many, many years. And when these changes occur, there is an emotional response. And it's called grief. And so, how do we deal with it? What do we do when we have these emotions? And often people try to carry on with the myths of grief. They try to be strong and push through it, but it's okay to pause and have a moment of awareness, to ask yourself or to think about what has changed and what response is this causing you, or what response is it causing from the other person that's impacted by it. And if you can honestly say that this change has come and it has caused some grief in my life, you are being very honest and true to yourself. Oftentimes people try to medicate a situation. They try to medicate change. Change is not going to go away with medication. It's not going to go away with drugs and alcohol. Change must be embraced. And although a lot of changes occur that are different than we ever expected or imagined, but this is life. We can face this, we can embrace change when we are honest. So I want to encourage grievers and grief supporters, if we can recognize that there are changes going on in our lives, if we can see that there is an emotional response that has been given as a result of this change, I want to invite you to pause, to be honest with where you are, and to devise a plan to move forward. You can embrace this change. And this change does not have to overwhelm you. This change does not have to silence you. But I want you to be empowered to embrace the changes that you are facing in your life right now. Understand that you are not alone. You're probably in good company with other grievers that are around you. Many of these grievers are not talking about the changes that they are going through. But I promise you, if you would be honest and have the conversation with others, you would realize that you are not alone in the changes that you are facing. Be empowered to embrace your truth as you embrace change. And as you move forward, do it with honesty and authenticity. Until next time, I'm Tanika Dillard, and thank you for joining me for this Grievers Empowerment Moment.